Okay, happy Monday, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our Facebook Live session. We got a very special session for you today. We actually have two masters with us. We have Master of Wine, Peter Marks, who will be interviewing Master Sommelier Tim Gaiser on some new developments on closures, corks more specifically, as well as TCA. So without further ado, let me bring these two fine gentlemen on screen. Okay, Peter.
Hello, everyone. And hello, Tim. How are you, Tim?
Hi, Peter. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm sorry we don't have your video feed. I think you just mentioned that you have a little bit of snow outside, so maybe there's some interference with the weather today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And you're in New Mexico, right?
Yeah, I'm in the Albuquerque area. I'm in Rio Rancho, which is northwest of Albuquerque. And, it's funny. It was a beautiful day yesterday, beautiful Easter day. And then it clouded up late, got windy, and woke up, and it started snowing at about 10 o'clock this morning. So,
yeah. Good. Well, I won't bore you, but it's blue skies and sunny and getting warmer in Napa. Yeah. So today we're talking about wine corks, and in particular cork taint, because this is something you've been researching a lot recently. Thought it would be a great time to sort of catch up and see what you've discovered and share some information. So for those of you who don't know about cork taint, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about what is TCA, which is the acronym for cork taint, and if you could sort of define that for us.
Yeah, right. That's a great question, Peter. It's really useful for students listening in to understand that this is a chemical compound. So common misinformation is that it's bacteria or that it's mold. But in fact, it's a chemical compound, and it's what happens when mold and chlorine substances get together. And TCA, or trichloranisol, is one of the anisols, chemical compounds or species. And there's multiple species. And they all fall under this umbrella category that's, musty type aromas in wine. And I think, you can safely say that TCA and all the variations of it are without a doubt a fault. They're always considered a fault in wine.
Right.
And what else about it? Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going I always tell people it reminds me of my grandmother's basement when I was a kid. She lived in New Jersey. And I remember going down where, her washer and dryer were located in, and it was just that damp, wet cement, cardboardy kind of smell. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up grandmothers, because my grandma was in South Texas, right? Subtropical climate. Yeah. Middle bedroom. She was not a hoarder, but she was a collector, shall we say, and she did not throw away books or magazines or newspapers. And the entire middle bedroom was stacked floor to ceiling with those things, and it just reeked of TCA. So that was my first baptism into it. Yeah. But what else can we say about it? Human sensory threshold for it is literally 5 parts per trillion, which is like 5 seconds in 64 years or something like that. And, it's obviously a huge concern to the industry because, it certainly accounts for a lot of tainted or ruined wines. And I think, the knee-jerk reaction has always been to point the finger at the cork industry. But, Peter, it's, as you well know, it's a really complex set of circumstances, in terms of its presence and what's the cause and best practices to avoid it.
Right. So tell us a little bit about where the TCA can be formed. Obviously it can be formed in cork, but could it come from other types of locations? Sure.
And this is where, of course, the other, members of this anisole family come into play, because if you do chemical analysis on wines that are suspect of having TCA, more often than not, it's, another of these compounds, although certainly TCA accounts for at least half of that. But in terms of where it comes from, if it's from a faulty cork, then odds are that the TCA is formed on raw cork bark before it ever reaches the processing plant, And some years ago, I actually went to Portugal and spent about a week there and saw cork forests and certainly cork processing plants, and got a pretty good education on how cork is made. And this was under the auspices of Amarim. And Amarim is, of course, the largest producer of cork stoppers on the planet. I mean, they produce 6 or 7 billion cork stoppers a year. So, I mean, in terms of the raw cork coming in and then going through a processing plant, there are multiple points where TCA can be formed. But again, the most common occurrences is when after the cork bark is harvested and it's cured outside for a minimum of 6 months, it could come into contact with the ground, and so the incidence of forming TCA is there. So now, of course, best practices are to harvest it, to cut off the part of the cork bark that came into contact with the ground or close to it, and then to store it on concrete or even metal pallets. So again, one of the old things that was problematic was the use of wooden pallets. So right there, again, you're isolating different steps even before it gets inside of a cork processing plant where TCA could form.
Got it. Yeah, I think I recall reading some research where the chlorine, after they harvest the bark, the chlorine that's on the ground was probably some residue from insecticides used, maybe 30, 50 years ago. So even that they could last that long. How many producers are now aging in a concrete location?
Well, the problem is, again, when we talk about Amarim and I think Colleos, who's another large producer, and there's third. So there are five producers in Portugal that account for probably 85% of the corks used in the planet. And certainly they are well financed, and they're all about best practices because, obviously they don't like product failure rates. But certainly you have hundreds of other cork processors, throughout the Mediterranean and Near East, and they don't have the facilities or the financing to be able to pull this off. So I guess you could leapfrog all the way to the end, Peter, and say for a winery, the winery really has to step up. The winery has to step up, and as a best practice, they have to spend the extra money on cork. And I guess now I could jump back into the middle of it and say, certainly there are many options now. This is such a deep subject, but of course you can choose to go the non-cork route and bottle with screw caps or plastic corks or vino locks, glass on glass with a silicone ring. Or you can use the agglomerated corks like Diam and like neutral cork. And Diam is produced by Onio in France, and I think their processing plants are in Spain. So that's where you're using agglomerated corks. And then we have to say, well, there are one of two methods that are used to get TCA out of ground or agglomerated cork. And one of them is what Diam uses, and that's supercritical CO2. So that's literally heating up CO2 to about 31 degrees centigrade, then putting it under 73 bars of pressure to where it's literally almost a liquid gas. And in that state, it can leach out 100% of the TCA that could be found in ground cork. And then, of course, then the agglomerated cork, they use substances to bind it, and they can guarantee zero TCA. And, more and more wineries are using it, and I'm happy. I was reading a figure the other day that says supposedly up to 40% of all Grand Cru Burgundy is now bottled under DM. So that's a very interesting figure if it's accurate. Okay?
Yeah, hate to open up a nice, expensive Burgundy and have it corked.
Oh, my God.
And that technique you just mentioned, the supercritical CO2, I mean, that's the same technique they use to remove caffeine from coffee, for example.
Exactly. And it's used in the perfume industry as well. Now, you mentioned, Grand Cru Burgundy. I remember years and years ago when I was on the floor as a sommelier, and I waited on Nunzio Aliotto, who's a good friend and fellow MS, and his wife. And they were in for dinner, and it was their anniversary, and he had a bottle of 78 La Tâche. And when we opened it, it was horribly corked. So
ouch.
The heartbreak of it. Anyway, then, stepping back into the topic of removing TCA in agglomerated cork, Amarim has their own patented process, and it's called ROSA. And instead of supercritical CO2, they're using steam and pressure together. And it's just as effective. I mean, they're removing up to 100% of all TCA. And so their cork, called neutral cork, is also a really highly sought after product. But now, two things that they have developed in the last couple of years, and one of them is using steam, but not so much pressure and over a longer period of time, so they can actually remove up to 2 nanograms of TCA in whole corks. And I think that's the newest development. but they also
so below threshold.
Yeah, below threshold. But now, to me, the most interesting thing that they've done and developed is they just developed high-speed gas chromatography. So now, in a 15-second time window, they can literally examine each cork for TCA. And they can, last year, I think, in 2019, I mean, in a 2-year span, they've done that to 150 million corks. So I think that's going to be the wave of the future, where, it's, removing TCA from whole corks has always been hugely problematic. And so I think being able to do individual gas chromatography tests on a cork and then guarantee a winery 0 TCA, I think is huge.
Now, is there a significant added cost to that procedure?
Why, I imagine there is. I don't know what it is. I heard something like the cost of being $1.70 per cork, which is expensive, but certainly you could amortize that cost into the bottle of wine easily,
Right. Maybe we should just touch base on a couple of the other causes of TCA in wine. It can come, as you mentioned, from wooden pallets. There have been some news items in the past that certain wineries have had TCA in the barrels, or causing TCA in the wine. And in fact, I have to tell you a quick story. A good friend of mine who will remain nameless worked for a very well-known winery, and in the environment where I live, this person was a wine expert, and because that person's threshold wasn't very low, or he had a high threshold for the TCA, he never realized it was in the wine. And I would just smell those wines and go, oh my gosh, that's not really drinkable. But so obviously some people could drink these wines and feel fine about it, but it can come from other places besides the cork.
It sure can. And, again, I remember going to a winery early on in the 80s in Napa, a well-known winery that will remain nameless. And walking in, they were still using chlorine substances to clean, the surfaces, and you could smell TCA. And I pointed that out, and the guy who was the winemaker, same story that you just related, he really didn't perceive it. So, so TCA in a winery environment. Peter, I don't know if you've ever been to Brazil, to Saragaucha wine country, but I remember walking through several wineries down there, and TCA and Brettanomyces, were just almost overwhelming, in the winery environment. So they get into the environment, but also into the tanks and barrels. And I remember in particular tasting a dry muscat from a producer down there in a screw cap bottle, and it was horribly corked. So, so
that's good advice. You should check a wine if it's in a screw cap, or even DM or glass top. Any of those still need to verify the wine sound.
Yeah, always. So I think now go ahead, please.
No, please.
Well, I was just going to say, I want to circle back. To the point that wineries need to use best practices too. Something as simple, if you don't use an entire bale of corks, to get rid of it. To don't use a twist tie and then, seal up a plastic bag and think that the corks are going to be okay for the next bottling run. Things as simple as that. And I've certainly seen it. So I think the wineries have to spend the money on good corks, and from a supplier that does gas chromatography themselves, a supplier like Scott Labs, or they have to spend the extra money on corks that are, guaranteed not to have TCA. But they need to do these steps as well.
Yeah. I don't know if this really works, and I haven't tried it in a number of years, but I have experimented with a corked wine, and I've taken some saran wrap and put it in, and it did alleviate the, and I've also heard milk can do the same thing. I'm sorry?
I don't know. I've tried it before, and it didn't do anything.
Didn't do anything. Well, so maybe our listeners should try that and report back.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think I told you when we talked 2 days ago that last month I had a call with Dr. Paulo Lopez, who's head of R&D for Amorim, and somehow that topic came up, and he just laughed. He said, "No, once TCA is in wine, there's no technology at this point to remove it." So I'll take the word from him.
Okay. Unless you want to steam it or supercritical CO2 your wine, which not everybody can do, right?
Microwave it, yeah.
Yeah. Sure. So what about some of these alternatives, maybe you can touch briefly on, say, synthetic corks and DM and screw cap and glass, and maybe starting with the DM, because that is probably the closest thing to a natural cork. Does that type of closure allow the wine to breathe the same?
So, Peter, that's a short question with a long answer. You know it. So we have to talk about two things, and trust me, I know barely enough to talk about them. And one of them is oxygen ingress. So that's the amount of oxygen that's introduced into the wine at the time of bottling, and that will vary with the kind of closure. So laboratory glass on glass, there's supposedly no oxygen ingress at the time of sealing. And then you've got screw cap as being the most anaerobic, least oxygen. And then a plastic cork, and then a regular cork. And then on top of that, there's the other acronym OTR, and that's the oxygen transmission rate. So that is secondarily pointing to how much oxygen over time does the closure allow into the wine. And I think you probably know more about that than I do. But, what's amazing about both of those pieces of information is that pre-2005, everyone thought a bottle of wine was anaerobic environment, which is crazy. And it was thanks to this guy, Dr. Paulo Lopez, that I think a project he did at the University of Bordeaux with carmine indigo testing. I think he was one of the first to show that, a closure not only introduces oxygen, but allows a transfer of oxygen over time. So, but again, that's about as much as I know about it.
Right. And even screw caps, while they're pretty much a hermetic seal, there are new liners that can allow some integration or allow some air to come in based on the type of aging process you prefer, right?
Yeah, that's a good point, because if you think back 15 years ago, for me, I don't know about you, but New Zealand Sauvignon Blancs were really problematic in that they were really I guess you could call it sulfur compounds, but also thiol esters, that they were really stinky, that they smelled like, rubber tires or tennis balls or something like that. Right. And that was from literally too much sulfur and too little oxygen allowed at the time of when the screw cap was put on the wine. So, yeah, it's complicated stuff. It really is.
And I think the answer is really up to the winemaker, what type of closure they use. And I think if you're making a wine like La Tâche or something that is a wine that might even improve with age, or certainly you prefer to put down, I think a natural cork is perhaps the best type of closure in that it does allow some integration of the oxygen, but over a very gradual period of time. But I guess screw caps might do the same, right?
Yeah, Peter, it's funny. It's almost like the CD versus vinyl argument. Because you and I grew up listening to music on records, because we're dating ourselves here. And that kind of the way, recording sounds on an LP it's warm and it's wonderful, and that's what we grew up with. But, that is not to say I certainly have had really high-end wines, red wines done under screw cap with some time, say 10 years or 15 years, and they're perfectly fine. They are slightly different in that they're not as oxidative in character, but they're fine. I think the beauty of it is that even in 15 years' time, so much has been done in terms of preventing TCA, but also the state-of-the-art for closures is like light years ahead of what it used to be. So I think that's really great. And so to your point,
I was going to say, it's funny you brought up the analogy of the vinyl, because vinyl's coming back now, and a lot of people who have tried screw caps in New Zealand, for example, in Australia, are now moving back to cork.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, absolutely.
Hey,
but
Tim,
I think it's just great that there's so many options. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Oh, I'm just keeping an eye. I see there's a question. Somebody asked a question about canned wine. What do you know? It's a different type of closure.
I don't know. I certainly have tried it, but I don't know enough about it to speak about it. So I will do some little research on that.
Okay, good. And by the way, if there are different or other questions, please put them in the chat box there. I do want to do, if you don't mind, a little plug for you, Tim, because we do have a webinar coming up with you on April 30th, which will actually be an in-depth webinar on all types of wine faults, not just talk about cork taint. But can you tell us a little bit what that what you'll cover in that course?
Well, we're just going to talk about all the categories of common wine faults and break them down one by one, whether they're from environment type impact or chemical type impact or oxidation or things like that. So we'll talk about, by category, then each particular fault, and then what it smells and tastes like, and also just some, quick and fast techniques that could be used to remove it if possible from a wine. But also I think what's important for people listening is that, with the exception of TCA, what we call wine faults are highly contextual. and think about, volatile acidity or Brettanomyces. And by context, I really mean which wine are we talking about? Because, there are certainly old world style type wines like Amarone from the Veneto, or old school Northern Rhone Syrah like Cornasco Roti, etc., where you may have high levels of VA or Brettanomyces, and historically it's really a part of the facet of the wine, as opposed to the same amount of Brett or VA in the Napa Valley Cabernet, in which it would be considered a flawed wine. So we'll take, context as part of how we present these wine faults, but then we'll also just do a really pretty thorough survey on them.
Sounds good. And then, yes.
Okay.
The question about, the question is a better method to use gas chromatography, or was it CO2 to remove TCA?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, but we need some clarification. First of all, you cannot remove TCA with gas chromatography. Gas chromatography simply identifies if TCA is present in cork substance or not, okay? The two techniques that are used to remove TCA are this supercritical CO2 or the use of steam and pressure. And it seems like they both work pretty well.
Yeah. And some people have, or at least in the past, they've used ozone, but I don't know what the results have been somewhat uncertain about that, I believe.
I don't think the amount of TCA can remove is high enough that it's in common use. At least that's what I know about it.
Okay. Christian, any other questions?
Mm-hmm.
So the other question we have is, I'm familiar with the description, but are there ways for us to produce or simulate TCA in a wine so we can learn the aroma or taste it firsthand?
That's a great question.
Well, I get it all the time when I buy those little baby carrots at the grocery store.
Yes.
Sometimes they have that that proper humidity and everything for the TCA to form.
Carrots are TCA magnet. So I would say tell this person to just go out and buy, a bag or two of them and open it. And then, if you really want it in wine, you could just, sounds odd, but you could drop a couple of carrots in a glass of wine, leave it for about 10 minutes, and there would be TCA in the wine, no doubt.
Okay.
There are some places where you can buy, if you go online, I think some wine aroma kits that sell you the TCA compound.
Yeah. Yeah, the Linez du Vin, the kit that's called Les Dufault, the Flaws. That's a kit that has 12 vials of, common wine faults, and just so advised that you should keep that in your garage and you should use it outside.
Right.
So,
Christian, another question there?
Yeah, so we have one that says, can you train for a lower threshold recognition, or are you just, forced to be where you are? Are you born with a threshold, or can you train for it?
Peter, do you want to take that first, or do you want me to?
I was going to offer you, Tim.
Okay, no, I think you can. I really do, because I remember, and this is going back over 30 years, not being really sensitive to cork, and now I'm hypersensitive to it. So I think over time, with enough repetition, you can become more sensitive to it.
Right, and I think part of that training is not only, as you mentioned, practicing, but knowing that TCA can cause a wine to lose its aroma or freshness, and not necessarily pick up what we typically call that taint, musty, cardboardy smell. But it can be such that if you're somewhat familiar with what the wine is or what the wine should taste like, and you notice that it's not up to your expectations, that can be a clue right then and there.
Yeah, how the fruit is suppressed for me is a huge tell. Yeah, good point.
Okay, and next question we have is, what do you think about glass closures versus screw cap?
Well, I think they're both effective. I would just say that for wineries, the screw cap is much more cost effective. I think the bottling line, setting up bottling line in terms of cost for screw cap versus vino lock, the glass is significantly more expensive. So, but I think they're both great.
Yeah, I don't know if this is true, Tim, but it's been a few years since I read this, but the plastic liner that they use between the cap and the bottle could allow some air into the wine to prematurely oxidize it. Whether that's true or not, I haven't found that to be an issue. But I did recently buy a bottle of Provence Rosé that had one of those glass liners. And to be honest, I had a hell of a time getting it off. I had to go into my toolbox, get a screwdriver to pry it out. And I don't have arthritis or anything like that. I just can imagine somebody trying to get that open and being totally disappointed.
Well, the way the sommelier thing is just to use the blade of a corkscrew, and that works very well. But you're right. I think in the past few years, what they're doing in terms of that silicone used in the ring between glass and glass, I think that is better.
Yeah.
Great. So, well, I wanted to thank.
Well, I think that's. Go ahead. I was just going to say thank you, Tim. Those are some great suggestions and great information today, and I'm definitely going to tune in on April 30th for your class. So thank you for being with us, and thanks to all of you out there too.
Yeah, well, thanks, Peter. It's great chatting as always, and thank you, Christian. And I'm looking forward to the webinar on the 30th.
Great. Well, thanks again, Peter and Tim. I think we could go on for quite a bit longer on this really fascinating subject. So much more to learn. So thanks for sharing those knowledge bombs with us today. Again, just as a reminder, we will be hosting a webinar with Tim on April 30th at 1:00. And we'll delve much deeper into all types of wine faults with Tim. We'll be back here regularly scheduled on Wednesday at 2:00 for another study hall session on a tasting topic. So make sure and join us back here on Wednesday, 2 p.m. In the meantime, stay safe, and thanks for joining us. Cheers.